Like a level 80 Metapod, this franchise is long overdue for an evolution. That was the final sentence, more or less, of the review for Pokemon Crystal, an electronic gaming monthly magazine, all the way back in 2001. Even 20 years ago, critics were already starting to get a bit weary of the Pokemon formula. The issue at the time was more of releasing a third version of the same game a few months after the initial release with improvements that honestly probably should have been in the base product in the first place, but even at the time, Pokemon was a franchise content to play it safe. 20 years later, and the franchise would iterate, but at a glacial pace, Game Freak and Nintendo unwilling to take many bold risks with their most profitable IP, seeing fit to do little more than adding minor quality of life improvements and bolstering the overall roster of monsters to collect, at least until that task itself collapsed under its own weight and we got the entire Dexit fiasco. Point is, Pokemon is a franchise that, ironically enough, never really evolved its core tenets, something that was staggeringly obvious when I returned to the series after over a decade of absence when reviewing Sword and Shield on my previous gaming channel, stunned that nearly everything I'd internalized from religiously playing Red, Blue, and Gold, Silver as a kid, and the casual playing of the next few entries after that, were more than enough to carry me through to victory. But the real reason Pokemon has never really taken any risks is that it's never had to. Despite growing frustration from the core fan base, Pokemon still outsells all its contemporaries on every system it's present on. And it's not just because people are merely consuming products, clapping, and getting excited about next product, though that isn't helping. There's still something oddly compelling about the formula Game Freak pioneered back in '96 that can still sink its hooks into you, even if your more critical side may be otherwise objecting, knowing that you've already walked this path a dozen times before. As much as I had to say about Dexit, the appalling visuals, and the incremental gameplay improvements, I still walked away from Sword and Shield having a good time, making the best curries for my Roselia of all Pokemon, because the stupid Pokemon camps tricked me into caring about the monsters I'd catch along my journey as more than just weapons and party balancing. It spoke to the core emotional tenet of the series that before Sword and Shield really had never had much of an active outlet while playing the game. But it seems like, after almost 30 years, Pokemon is finally deciding to make some bigger design changes. Arceus feels like a test run, a way of taking the feedback that crescendoed with Sword and Shield's release and having a safe, spin-off playground to experiment with new ideas that maybe, hopefully, will carry over to mainline entries if they're received well, but threaten nothing if they aren't. Considering the record-breaking pace people have been buying this game, and that, even with the discussion around Pokemon as a whole being as cynical as it was following the tumultuous release of Sword and Shield and the blatant cash grab that was Pokemon Unite, the consensus seems to be that this game is a win. So I can't see Game Freak not using Arceus as a template for future installments. This game does so much to rebuild goodwill from fans by actually trying out a lot of new things, even if it still shows that a lot of the issues with Pokemon as a franchise, specifically the technical ones, may be something Game Freak just isn't equipped to handle internally. I've been playing Legends for roughly 15 hours and recorded my first 6, so the footage here will be early and spoiler free. This is more of a first impression than review, but even early on, I'm mostly happy with this game. A game I was pretty cynical about following its announcement. It may have taken a few decades, but Pokemon Legends Arceus may finally be that level 81 Butterfree EGM was waiting for. Pokemon Legends on the surface might seem like just another Pokemon spin-off, similar to something like Colosseum or Gales of Darkness back on the GameCube, a title that takes the basic DNA of the series, tweaks it slightly, and sends you on your way. Look a little closer though, and Arceus mixes things up in a way that other spin-offs haven't. It really feels like the next step forward for the franchise. Like Sword and Shield before it, random battles are a thing of the past, with the player able to see every Pokemon on the field they can potentially battle. Unlike Sword and Shield, though, where this served little purpose beyond helping you hunt down specific monsters, which was already a blessing, Legends further refined this concept by doing something that seems obvious in hindsight. You can just throw Pokeballs at Pokemon out in the wild to catch them, without needing to trigger a battle. In a reversal of the long-standing convention, now you can hide in the tall grass and sneak up on unsuspecting Pokemon, catching them before they even have a chance to engage with you, with bonuses granted for taking them completely by surprise. You still gain XP for catching Pokemon without a battle, and XP sharing is still granted by default. So just like with Sword and Shield before it, there's very little friction in catching a boatload of monsters and making sure new additions to your party can quickly be brought up to speed. Stealth isn't always going to work though. Sometimes a Pokemon will spot you, or your Pokeball will fail and the monster will aggro towards you. Yes, you, not your Pokemon. Probably the biggest shift in Legends is the fact that the game is set hundreds of years before the mainline series, at a time when Pokemon and humans weren't nearly as buddy-buddy as you're used to. Stand in the middle of a field too long, and the nearby Pokemon will start attacking you outright, and taking too many hits from attacks will knock you out. Your only defense at this point is your own Pokemon, which is a concept still relatively new to the Hisui region. The village you become a part of is one of the first places to invent Pokeballs, and the local professor is seemingly the original inventor of the Pokedex, retconning it being Oak's creation in Gen 1, so most of the people outside the starting area are suspicious of your motives, carrying around a small army of barely tamed monsters on your belt as you enthusiastically throw yourself at wild animals stoked to kill you. Even the majority of the denizens of your home village are still too afraid to actually see Pokemon in person, their quests often to see completed Pokedex data on monsters they're curious about, rather than observe them firsthand. It's an interesting shift in dynamic of the series. Pokemon that are living flamethrowers have for so long been trusted to 10-year-olds in this series, so seeing a populace treating the creatures with a degree of reverence and caution is surprisingly refreshing, and makes your fearless trek into the wild to tame them all the more impressive by comparison. In battle, things play out nearly identically to the Pokemon battles of old, but with a fair amount of small tweaks that breathe an extra bit of life into the familiar. Everything is still turn-based, with you and your opponent trading blows, but speed plays a bit more into the equation than normal. It isn't a perfect staccato of back and forth. Sometimes your Pokemon can attack twice, sometimes the opponent's. Less aggressive Pokemon might be content to just observe instead of act outright or run away entirely. Fail to catch a Pokemon too many times and it becomes enraged, increasing all of its base stats temporarily. Instead of moving to a nondescript battle environment when challenged, battles now happen on the same map you've been traversing, making the whole experience a bit more cohesive. Because you can see all the wild Pokemon on screen, it's possible to challenge multiple Pokemon at once, as any surrounding monsters to your target can choose to enter the fray at any time, which can lead to tense 2 or 3v1 matches that can test your abilities since, at least in the first handful of hours I've played, there's no way to use more than one monster yourself. As your Pokemon gain experience, they can master their moves, letting you slightly modify how the ability works. Strong style moves can do more damage, but increase the time it takes before your Pokemon can act again, which brings that speed effect back into play. Conversely, Agile style does the opposite, reducing effectiveness but gives your monster a speed boost. Enemy Pokemon can also have mastered moves, so it's something you need to consider at all times. It isn't the most in-depth combat experience, but it can come in clutch during the aforementioned gang-up battles, where an extra hypnosis or super effective hit can make or break your chances. Combine that with the fact that Pokemon no longer have to forget moves in order to learn new ones, but have a pool of learned moves that you can sign 4 of at any time, leads to a fair bit more flexibility in how you approach tougher scenarios, letting you cater your party's moveset to the challenge ahead, rather than making permanent choices. If all your Pokemon are wiped out in a battle, you don't immediately lose like in previous titles. Instead, the wild Pokemon will then continue attacking you directly again, with your defenses now taken care of. A dodge roll with iframes right out of a traditional action game is all that keeps you from a humiliating end, and can resort in a tense chase as you are running away from a gang of Graveler hurling rocks at you or something. Though, worrying about damage to yourself is a threat even with your own Pokemon on the field. While the battle is still going on, you can still move freely around with the analog stick because your position as a character still matters. Stick too close to your Pokemon, and that enemy Hyper Beam that just blew through your Luxray can also knock you on your ass as well. Probably the most interesting thing that Legends does is something the mainline Pokemon games haven't done in years. It dials up the difficulty. I'm used to coming in and almost playing Pokemon games on autopilot. One of my biggest complaints with Sword and Shield was that there was no challenge to the main campaign, easily being able to curb stomp the entire League challenge without a second thought. Legends does a lot more to make things more engaging. Damage scaling in general seems to be a lot more aggressive than previous titles, as evidenced by a basic potion now healing 60 HP instead of 20, and a basic crafting system lets you create potions, Pokeballs, and revives out in the wild without going back to town. Crafting, combined with XP share by default, had me worried that this game was going to be even easier than Sword and Shield, but it quickly became clear that the game is balanced around having access to these systems. Even wild Pokemon a fair bit lower level than you can still land solid hits, and the fact that a second or third monster can wander into a battle in progress can quickly complicate a situation you might otherwise have had a handle on. Alpha Pokemon are similar to powered-up monsters in the wild area from Sword and Shield, but are considerably more aggressive than even the normal monsters in Legends, while also being a good 15 plus levels stronger than the normal fare of the area. Hiding from them is usually the best play, but challenging them and catching them can be a thrilling accomplishment, and something I'd sorely missed being able to do in Sword and Shield. The powered-up Pokemon there couldn't be captured until you had the correct badges. Here, if you can make it work, it works. All these new mechanics are tied together with a much more robust Pokédex system in Legends. While in previous titles, seeing and catching the monsters was all you needed to complete the pages, Arceus leans into its setting by emphasizing there's a lot more to learn about these creatures at this point in time, so each entry in the Pokédex has to be leveled up from 1 to 10 by completing various challenges, from catching a certain number of Pokemon at a certain time of day, seeing it use specific moves, or catching alpha versions, forcing battles with the game's strongest monsters. This system helps a lot with making repeat battles feel more important than just grinding XP for your party. Research goals are numerous enough that every few battles you're accomplishing something whether you're meaning to or not, which again helps the game incentivize catching lots of Pokemon instead of just settling into an optimized party early and throwing them at everything to maximize their effectiveness, a trap I frequently fall into playing earlier titles. All this is to say Legends Arceus is really fun, but it's not perfect. Game Freak took a PR beating back in 2019 over the technical aspects of Sword and Shield, and Legends doesn't do all that much to improve things. This is a very good-looking PlayStation 2 game, and as much as I love the PS2, sadly it's not a compliment here. Textures in normal maps are abysmally low resolution, which blurry results clash harshly with the cel-shaded lighting and facial features that have a much cleaner edge. Pokemon are still comically simple models with little in terms of detail, and possibly still the same models we've seen since the 3DS. The game's LODs are incredibly aggressive, with pop-in happening too close to the camera and too often. I know the Switch is running a 5-year-old mobile GPU, but looking at games like Monster Hunter Stories and Rise, and ports like Doom 2016 and The Witcher 3 being able to run on this hardware, there's really no excuse for Nintendo's premier franchise to look this rough around the edges. The lack of voice acting isn't a huge detriment to me personally, but its absence becomes a more glaring omission with each passing entry, and hurts double with the visuals also being so anemic. The world in general just feels painfully last gen, empty and static. The Pokemon you encounter and the NPCs that give you quests are basically all there is to these environments. Structurally, the world isn't any more complicated than the original Kanto design of Red and Blue. You would think that with this low level of fidelity we could at least get 60 frames per second, but Game Freak's engine is still capped at 30, which makes a lower fidelity experience a choppy one as well. None of these are technically deal breakers or make the game less fun. The systems are still there, but the fact that the most profitable game franchise can't also be a technical tour de force for Nintendo's flagship hardware continues to be as disappointing as it is baffling. Other than the technical issues though, there really isn't anything I have against Arceus. Perhaps maybe my only complaint would be that Pokemon attacks home in on you, which makes the dodge roll a bit more difficult to pull off when the attacks aren't moving in a specific direction, which makes predicting and dodging a fair bit more difficult than it would be in a traditional action game, but that just might be my Devil May Cry speaking. It's still a bit simple, but so far I've been really happy with this series finally taking more than baby steps forward. Maybe my expectations are just that low with this franchise at this point. Nevertheless, the gameplay advancements here are absolutely a step in the right direction. Pokemon feels fresh again, which is something I haven't been able to say in years. Arceus proves that Game Freak still have some good ideas conceptually for the series, but their lack of experience with 3D games are still evident to this day. With other Pokemon spin-offs like Pokemon Snap recently, looking and animating significantly better on the same hardware in the hands of Bandai Namco, it may be time for Game Freak to collaborate with another studio to handle the visuals of the next title. Putting Pokemon alongside Mario Odyssey, Metroid Dread, Zelda, Splatoon, and Nintendo's other heavy hitters really makes the technical shortcomings of this game all the more apparent. Pokemon deserves better than this, and I hope Game Freak gives it the facelift the series deserves eventually, sooner rather than later.